Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to Ream Library. I'm sorry, I should stand back. My name's Brent Otto, and I'm Global Catholicism Fellow in the McFarland Center for Religion, Ethics, and Culture here at the College of the Holy Cross. The McFarland Center fosters dialogue on questions of meaning, morality, and mutual responsibility, and promotes deeper understanding of Catholicism in a global context. As we continue our fall series, Catholic Resistance to Authoritarianism, Finding Moral Courage, it is fitting that our final speaker draws us into one of the most powerful modern witnesses to Christian conscience and Jesuit education, the Jesuit martyrs of the University of Central America in El Salvador, who were killed in 1989, and the living legacy that their witness continues to inspire throughout the world. Throughout this series, this fall, we've seen how Catholics across history have resisted the seductions of power and the violence of authoritarian systems. And so tonight we turn to an event that crystallizes those themes, a moment when the Jesuit mission responded with clarity, courage, and solidarity. On November 16, 1989, 6 Jesuit priests, teachers, intellectuals, pastors, along with their housekeeper and her daughter, were assassinated at the UCA, the University of Central America in San Salvador. They were killed because they told the truth about state violence, stood with the poor, and insisted that the mission of a Catholic university includes the pursuit of justice. Their deaths became a global moral reckoning and reshaped Jesuit education and ministry for the decades since. Our speaker today, Kerr, carries that legacy forward with purpose. As the executive director of the Ignatian Solidarity Network, he leads an organization which was born from the spirit of those martyrs, forming students, parishes, and schools for courageous, faith-filled engagement with the injustices of our time. The Ignatian Solidarity Network works where spirituality meets social transformation, grounded in the conviction that human dignity is not negotiable. I've seen that work personally up close, whether taking students to the gates of Fort Benning and the Teach-In for Justice in Washington, or serving on the ISN board for a few years. Chris has guided the Ignatian Solidarity Network for more than a decade of growth and is, I would say, truly one of the best connected people I know within the Jesuit network in this country. So there is no one truly better to speak about this legacy of the Jesuit martyrs for Catholic justice advocacy today. Chris will this evening lead us through 2 movements, I believe. First, the story of the Jesuit martyrs and the political and ecclesial context of 1980s El Salvador, and then second, to how their legacy connects to animate Jesuit ministries today, especially through the work of ISN here in this country. So this is a fitting close to our series. The martyrs remind us that authoritarianism always has a human cost. And Chris will remind us that resistance rooted in faith is not futile. Please join me in welcoming Kerr.
Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's great to be here at Holy Cross. It's been such a wonderful welcome into this community, both from the Jesuit community and the campus community. The Ignatian Solidarity Network has a strong, long partnership with the College of the Holy Cross since our founding in 2004. And I'm grateful for the invitation from Father Otto. And I even got a chance to experience 9 p.m. Mass last night in the chapel, which was great. It brought me back to my college campus ministry days, so thank you for that. I also just want to say I'm personally grateful to have this opportunity to reflect on the martyrs. You know, in the midst of the busyness of this work, it can be easy to kind of lose track of what you're doing or not take enough time to slow down and reflect on it. So I'm really grateful for that. I was like a lot of the students here in this room many years ago, not necessarily knowing much about the martyrs' story when I was an undergraduate at John Carroll University, but just like you all, I entered into experiences with an open mind and an open heart, and I can honestly say that their legacy has changed me. Their legacy has shaped the people I've come to know. Their legacy has shaped the books I've read, the news I've followed, the way I try to be in relationship with God, and how that relationship is tied to my commitment of being a person of justice. So as I share my reflections tonight on their lives and what their legacy can inspire, please know that my thoughts are filled with the thoughts of the martyrs and others they have inspired. And I am really just a prism for those powerful ideas and movements, and I hope that I can let a little bit of their light shine through me through this presentation. I also wanted to share that I just came from Washington, D.C., where ISN welcomed nearly 2,000 people, including Holy Cross students and staff, to the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. Is anyone with the Holy Cross group? All right, 1, 2, excellent. Welcome back, welcome home. And for 3 days, we prayed, we learned, we reflected, we connected, and then we fanned out across Capitol Hill for the largest annual Catholic Advocacy Day in the United States. And I need to say I'm feeling a little bit exhausted, but also deeply energized, especially to be here with you all. And I'll tell you a little bit more about the teach-in and even a little bit about the Holy Cross delegation's experience. But I want to begin tonight with the story that Father Otto was talking about. The story of the UCA martyrs is a story of courage. It's a story of clarity. It's a story of consequence. It's a story of 8 lives, 6 Jesuit priests, a mother and her teenage daughter, each animated by deep faith and a stubborn hope that God's love could take root even amid violence, inhumanity, and injustice. It's not a story we revisit simply just to remember it. We're not just doing this just to recall what happened and move on. It's a story that we return to every year in places like the College of the Holy Cross so that we can learn how to live. How to live as people of faith who understand that we cannot follow the gospel without seeking justice for all God's people. So we're going to begin with a brief glimpse into the reality of El Salvador during that time of the martyrs. The following is an excerpt from the documentary known as Blood of the Martyrs, which was produced by Loyola Productions in 2014 in partnership with the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And this just gives you a little taste of what was happening then and a few brief reflections on what it meant to people, what those events meant to people.
Today marks my first State of the Union address to you, a constitutional duty as old as our republic itself.
In El Salvador, one of the most brutal and violent days in 10 years of war. While rebels and government troops continued fighting for control of the capital city of San Salvador, a group of armed men entered a university there and brutally murdered 8 people, including 6 Jesuit priests.
Extreme right-wing politicians and sectors of the armed forces have for a long time considered the Jesuits to be the intellectual authors of the leftist insurgency here.
Faith takes courage, faith takes energy, it takes passion, it takes commitment. That's what they represented, and ultimately they paid the price.
In the midst of so much horror, there have been good people.
Sus vidas son ejemplo de entrega, ejemplo de servicio a los demás, ejemplo de búsqueda de la justicia.
La pregunta debe ser, ¿quién resuelve más humanamente los problemas de las mayorías populares? No quién da más libertades formales a las minorías elitistas.
I was awakened by the suffering of the Jesuits, of the innocent people. I realized that there were thousands, millions of people on crosses, and we had to take them down from their crosses. It does still animate us to continue to do what we know must be done so that peace can happen and be what we call the kingdom of God.
La carne sola hay un rato, no crea que soy guayón, son pellejos para los gatos que empezaban de pilón, no tiran.
Nos logramos poner de acuerdo y logramos tener líneas, grandes líneas, que nos permitieran saber hacia dónde más o menos podíamos ir.
La vida de nuestros hermanos jesuitas nos hace sentir que vale la pena trabajar por un mundo distinto, por un mundo más justo.
Está primero las necesidades básicas del 80 al 90% de la población. Y luego está la libertad de expresión, la libertad de otras cosas que son muy importantes también.
Creo yo de que esa sangre no debe de quedar derramada simplemente y recordarla, sino que esa sangre sea inspiración para nosotros para continuar. Ese es el gran deber que tenemos en nuestro país y creo que en todos los países del mundo.
I wish, before I die, to watch this shamelessness disappear. I wish to see goodness, which is present in the planet, grows more and more and more.
How many of you were born before or after 1989? Raise your hand if you're after. Yeah, okay, most of you. Yeah, that's kind of depressing, but okay. So for those of you who were born after that date, all right, the Salvadoran Civil War, so much of what we saw at the beginning of that video can feel really distant, right? Something from a history class, maybe you've studied in a history class or a theology class, something you'd watch in a documentary, or just a footnote maybe in something you read. But underneath the headlines were real human beings living under real systems of oppression. El Salvador in the 1980s was a nation where 90% of the wealth was controlled by 10% of the population. Entire villages were massacred. Thousands of civilians were disappeared or tortured. Propaganda campaigns targeted anyone who dared to speak the truth, including priests, religious sisters, and lay leaders who were killed for standing with the poor. People like Sisters Dorothy Kazel, Ida Ford, Mara Clark, and laywoman Jean Donovan, as well as Jesuit priest Blessed Retiro Grande, and Archbishop, now Saint Oscar Romero. And behind all of this was the United States, providing nearly $1 million a day in military aid and training thousands of Salvadoran soldiers at what was then called the School of the Americas, including many of those who carried out the murders at the UCA that night in November of '89. Now, rather than reciting the resumes of these 8 remarkable people, I want to introduce them to you one by one in a way I believe they would prefer, through their calling, through their vocation, not through their credentials or their academic degrees or anything like that, but the way the gospel shaped their life and what makes their witness so meaningful today. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about each one of them. Elba Ramos and Selena Ramos were a mother and her teenage daughter who lived and worked alongside the Jesuits. That night they sought refuge at the Jesuit residence, a reminder that war did not only claim public figures or activists, it claimed more than 70,000 innocent Salvadorans over those 10 or so years, most of them civilians, most of them economically poor. Elba and Selena's presence among the martyrs tells the truth. This was not just an attack on priests, it was not just an attack on labor leaders, it was an attack on the real people of El Salvador, everyday people. Father Joaquin Lopez y Lopez was the founder of schools for impoverished youth in El Salvador, the Fe y Alegría schools. He believed that education was one of the most radical acts of love in a violent world because it equips people who have very little not only to dream, but have the ability to act on those dreams. Father Juan Ramon Moreno and Father Armando Lopez were teachers and theologians who formed students to integrate intellect, conscience, and compassion. They lived with the Jesuit conviction that faith and justice cannot be separated, and that education must shape people for service in our world, not for status. Father Ignacio Martín Baró, a pioneering psychologist who understood that trauma is not only personal, it is social, historical, and structural. Martín Baró taught a simple but world-changing truth. Healing requires justice, because suffering rooted in oppression cannot be mended by silence. Father Segundo Montes, a sociologist whose research documented forced displacement and in doing so dismantled the government's narrative about the war. His meticulous data revealed what the poor already knew. People were not fleeing communism, they were fleeing government-sponsored terror. And finally, Father Ignacio Echeverría, philosopher, university president, public intellectual. But more than anything, Echeverría was a man who believed the gospel demands that we bring the suffering of the world into the center of our moral imagination. He taught that the task of a Christian university is not only to analyze reality, but to seek to transform it. And he insisted that our first responsibility is to the crucified people of history, the poor, the displaced, the disappeared, the silenced. Echeverría stands last not because he was greater than the others, but because he helps us understand the horizon they were all walking toward. A faith that seeks truth, a truth that demands justice, and a justice rooted in love. Now, when we ask, why did the government want to kill them? Why did they fear them? We need to be clear about something from the start, okay? The Jesuits at the UCA were not revolutionaries in the way that their enemies, that the government claimed. They were not plotting a coup. They were not calling for violence. In fact, they spoke out against violence. They were not backing a political party. Their threat was something far more powerful and far more dangerous to those who depended on silence to sustain the status quo in the country. They were feared because they were trusted. Trusted by the poor, trusted by their students, trusted by the international community. Their words carried moral weight, and a regime built on fear cannot tolerate people who speak with integrity. They were feared because they told the truth, not partisan truth, not ideological truth, but truth rooted in research, testimony, lived experience, and rigorous analysis. Their classrooms became places where lies collapsed. Their studies exposed disappearances, displacement, and terror. And once a truth is spoken out loud, it cannot be easily buried again. They were feared because they insisted the conflict was moral, not military. The government preached anti-communism. The Jesuits preached human dignity. And when you claim to be defending the nation, but the church says you are destroying your people, your narrative is in jeopardy. They were feared because their solidarity broke rules. They did not help the poor from a safe distance. They lived with them. They listened to them. They put their bodies in spaces where the state, the government preferred they not be. When a society is built on strict divisions between rich and poor, military and civilian, powerful and powerless, solidarity can quickly become perceived as a subversive act. They were feared because they believed peace was possible. And peace, real peace, requires accountability, truth commissions, reforms, and the end of government impunity. For those whose power depended on violence and repression, peace was not a blessing, it was a threat. And finally, they were feared because they were not alone. They were not alone. They were part of a global Jesuit network connected to universities like the College of Holy Cross, Georgetown University, Santa Clara University. They were connected to churches, journalists, human rights organizations. What happened in the dark night in San Salvador would be known by morning in Rome, Madrid, Washington, D.C., and beyond. You cannot disappear people who are surrounded by solidarity. But what happened at the UCA, the clarity, the courage, the solidarity, did not come out of nowhere, okay? This was not an isolated flare of holiness, some random thing. It was the fruit of a deep movement unfolding within the Catholic Church and within the Society of Jesus across the 20th century. To understand the martyrs, we have to understand the reality of the church and the Jesuit religious order that was around them, around the martyrs, okay? A movement that began long before them in the earliest instincts of St. Ignatius of Loyola, the founder of the Jesuits, and his first companions. They believed that faith must always engage the real world, that a God found in all things is not just found in sacred things, that a spirituality rooted in discernment about complex realities is not something you separate from, and a mission committed to helping souls, which in Ignatius' time meant entering into the struggles, the fears, and the hopes of people, living amid a changing world of political, cultural, and economic pressures. That Ignatian DNA, if you will, was always there. But in the 20th century, the church and the Jesuits felt the Spirit asking them to read the world with new clarity. When the Second Vatican Council convened in the early 1960s, the church asked a bold question. What does it mean to be a church for the world, not simply in the world? What does it mean to be a church for the world, not simply in the world? The council called the whole church to read the signs of the times. It called the church to discernment, to see God's presence not only in the sacraments and sanctuaries, but also in the cries of the poor, the struggles for human rights, the movements for peace, and the suffering of those pushed to the margins. For the Jesuits, the council's call took on life through Father Pedro Arrupe, the superior general of the Jesuits from 1965 to 1983. Father Arrupe wasn't someone who studied theories. Well, I should say he probably studied theories, but he wasn't someone who only studied theories. He was a man marked by the reality of his experiences. Arrupe served the wounded and dying after the atomic bombing in Hiroshima. He listened to the stories of Vietnamese refugees fleeing war and persecution in the 60s. And by traveling to places across the globe where Jesuits were in ministry, he saw global poverty up close, not as statistics, but as human faces. These experiences convinced Arrupe of something profoundly simple. Following Christ requires both a deep personal relationship with Christ and a historical responsibility to respond to the realities of those who are economically poor and vulnerable. A historical responsibility. So it wasn't just one or the other, a personal relationship with Christ or a historical responsibility to those on the margins. It was both and always together. Arrupe did not invent a new mission for the Jesuits. He simply helped the Jesuits deepen their focus on what Ignatius always intended. A spirituality that looks outward, moves toward the suffering, and asks, how is God calling us to respond right now in this moment in history? In the famous address in 1973 to alumni of Jesuit schools in Europe, Arrupe said something that still shapes Jesuit education worldwide. How many of you have heard this phrase? Oh, wait, it's not up there. So let me tell you what the phrase is, then I'll ask you if you heard it. Our students must become men and women for others. How many of you have heard that? Men and women for others. Okay, good. So this phrase was very intentional. Arupe was talking to a group of alumni who had graduated from Jesuit schools. They were actually all guys, so the original version just said men, okay, but it's been adapted because Jesuit schools educate women too. And he was lamenting. He was expressing frustration that the schools had not fulfilled their full mission. So he was trying to say, our students must not become men and women just for achievement, not men and women just for success, not men and women just for comfort, but men and women for others. That we have to take an outward approach, that our education, our spiritual formation is not just about ourselves, but how we bring that out into the world. Men and women whose lives are oriented toward the common good, especially towards the most vulnerable. He insisted that the genuine Christian love must always include the promotion of justice, not as an optional expression of faith, but as an essential one. In 1975, a couple years later, the Jesuits gathered for their general congregation. It's a big global meeting that the Jesuits have every so often. And it was General Congregation 32, and it changed the course of a lot of Jesuit history, I think. There they declared that the mission of the Society of Jesus is the service of faith, of which the promotion of justice is an absolute requirement. Not something you do if you want to, not something you do if you feel like your relationship with God is okay, that it is an absolute requirement of how you live out your faith. It was the first time that Jesuits named this explicitly, but it had been growing for centuries, quietly, through the choices of Jesuits who refused to ignore the needs of those in need around them. GC 32 gave language to a conviction that Ignatius had planted long ago. Faith is never whole if it does not seek the justice that God desires. The Jesuits who died at the UCA were not rebels or outliers. They were exactly what the Church and the Society of Jesus had been forming them to be. Contemplatives who engage reality rather than retreating from it. Scholars who believe that truth serves liberation. Pastors who let suffering of their people shape their understanding of God. And educators who believe that faith and justice were inseparable. Their martyrdom was not a tragic exception. It was a heartbreaking confirmation of the path that the church had chosen. It meant that we were moving in the right direction. Tragic, but moving in the right direction. We were standing with those the world crucifies, and to proclaim with the words and with the lives that the gospel demands nothing less. When we remember the martyrs, it can be tempting to place them safely in the past, as if they were heroic figures from another era, facing challenges unlike our own. But the story of the UCA martyrs doesn't allow for that, because their lives weren't just one chapter in a book about Salvadoran history, okay? Their lives were the flowering of a movement of the church that is still happening today. And their deaths did something the government never intended when they went onto that campus that night in 1989. Their blood didn't silence the movement. It illuminated it. It brought awareness to it. Their witness didn't end at the UCA. It echoed through Jesuit universities like this one, Jesuit secondary schools, and in the hearts of Jesuits and lay collaborators around the world. It's why we're here today, right? And so the question their lives leave us with is not what happened in 1989, but what will we do with the inheritance of what happened in 1989? The martyrs help us to see that faith is not fulfilled just by our relationship with God. Faith is fulfilled when we take responsibility for the suffering of others, not in the abstract, but in the concrete, messy realities of our own time. This time, right now. They remind us that truth still needs defenders. Even in our own country, truth still needs defenders. The poor and the marginalized still need companions. Peace still requires prophetic people, and justice still asks us to move our feet. Memory becomes discipleship only when it shapes our choices. How are we going to let this story shape our choices? And so this brings us to the question before us in 2025 at Holy Cross, in our communities, and in our church. How do we live the kind of faith they lived? A faith that refuses silence, refuses indifference, and refuses to separate love of God from love of neighbor. So this is where the story turns. Because the witness of the martyrs did not merely inspire people, it mobilized people. It stirred consciences, it opened eyes, it created a longing, especially in the Jesuit network, to walk in the direction of the martyrs, walk in the direction that the martyrs were walking. And that longing over time began to take shape. So let me tell you a little bit about how it took shape and how it came to be the Ignatian Solidarity Network, okay? It took shape in vigils that started to happen immediately after the Jesuits were killed. There might have been one here at Holy Cross soon afterwards. I'm sure there was. It took shape in buses that headed to Georgia. It took shape in tents on muddy fields and students hearing the story of El Salvador for the first time, and in communities discovering that the gospel is a story about God's love for us and how we need to illuminate that love by upholding the inherent human dignity of our brothers and sisters. That longing is part of what eventually grew into the Ignatian Solidarity Network. And so now I want to turn from El Salvador in 1989 to the United States in the mid-90s and tell you how a group of people shaken by the martyrs' witness began to ask a simple but dangerous question. What would it look like to mobilize the Jesuit family to respond to the injustices of our own time? To understand how the Ignatian Solidarity Network came to be, we have to return to a moment of shock and grief, an awakening in the United States. When the news of the Uca martyrs, or the Uca murders, reached this country in November of '89, it pierced the hearts of many. In fact, I'm sure if you ask Jesuits here at Holy Cross or other places about that day, probably the next morning, they can tell you exactly where they were when they found out that the Uca martyrs were killed. It's one of those days, like 9/11 or the end of World War II or something like that, right? So Jesuits, alumni, students, and parish communities, and people far beyond the Jesuit world were impacted by this. And one of those people was a gentleman named Bob Holstein. Bob was a former Jesuit who became a labor lawyer after he left the society. He got married to a woman who was a nun, and they had 4 kids, all right? But his spirituality was deeply shaped. His Ignatian spirituality was deeply shaped. And he couldn't shake what happened in El Salvador. He couldn't get over it. He had known some of the Jesuits who were killed. He had prayed like them. He had learned from them. He understood that their deaths were not random, that their deaths revealed something about what faithfulness to the gospel looks like in a world scarred by injustice. And so Bob kept asking himself a question that would become kind of like a spiritual itch in him. What are we being called by our faith to do in the United States in response to these acts of violence and injustice? Not in theory, but in practice. How are we being called to speak out against this horror that our government helped to create? So in the early 90s, Bob began traveling each November to Fort Benning, Georgia. This was the training site or the site of the U.S. Army School of the Americas, where many Salvadoran soldiers, including several involved with the Uca murders, had received instruction. And he joined vigils at the gates with a small band of peace activists. Each year, he felt something deepening him, a conviction that remembering the martyrs must involve confronting the structures that enabled their deaths. He wanted to confront the structures that were causing this, okay? And so in 1995, that conviction led him into an act of nonviolent civil disobedience. It was a mock simulation of a massacre in a Salvadoran village on the Fort Benning grounds. He was arrested, he was charged with federal trespassing, and he spent 90 days in federal prison, separated from his wife and his 4 children. I just talked with his wife last night, and she reminded me that the youngest was 13, and that having a 13-year-old girl by herself for 90 days was almost as much of a punishment as Bob being in prison. So it was costly, right? But like so many prophets before him, Bob emerged clear, not discouraged. And his question sharpened. He started to ask, how do we mobilize the Jesuit network, students, alumni, parishes, high schools, universities, to speak out and dismantle these unjust structures, such as those that led to the murders of the Uka Jesuits, their companions, and many other people, tens of thousands of other people. Convinced that something new needed to emerge, Bob took a risk. He called a tent company in Georgia and rented the largest tent they had without any guarantee that it could be filled. I don't know how much it cost, but I know he paid for the whole thing. All right? Then he made another call to Father Charlie Curry, who was then the president of the Association of Jesuit Colleges and Universities in Washington, D.C. And he told Charlie his plan. He said, let's gather the Jesuit network at Fort Benning. Let's teach, let's pray, let's tell the story of the martyrs. Let's ask them to reflect on what the gospel requires of us today. Now, if most people had gotten this call, they probably would have just hung up, okay? But Charlie wasn't most people. You see, Charlie had been deeply involved in the congressional investigation into the Uka martyrs, led by the late Congressman Joe Moakley. He had traveled repeatedly to El Salvador with Congressman Moakley and a young staffer, someone Holy Cross knows well, now Congressman Jim McGovern. Charlie had seen the devastation with his own eyes. So when Bob called, he didn't hesitate. He started calling every Jesuit university in the country. And that November, 28 Jesuit colleges and universities, along with numerous Jesuit high schools and parishes, got on buses and planes and caravans of vans and made the pilgrimage to El Salvador. And they came to a field, a muddy, cold, remote place where a single large tent stood waiting. And inside that tent, something extraordinary happened. And I was there that first year. There was music, there was lament, there was a roll call of schools that made people realize they were part of something bigger than themselves. There were testimonies that broke the hearts of people. There was Eucharist. There was hope. Students who had never heard the story of the martyrs learned it for the first time. Faculty and parish leaders found themselves asking new questions about their responsibility in a global church. And the Spirit moved. The tent became kind of like a classroom, a sanctuary, a launching pad, all at once, a place where the memory of the martyrs turned into a mandate to take action. And as the teaching grew over the next decade, often drawing a few thousand people each year, especially for the closing Mass, leaders in the Jesuit world began to ask, what if this energy didn't have to wait until November? What if we built something that could animate the Ignatian family year-round? And in 2004, that question got answered. The Ignatian Solidarity Network was founded, a lay-led organization working in partnership with the Jesuits, committed not only to keeping the memory of the martyrs alive, but to forming generations of people who would refuse to separate faith from justice. Today, 2 decades later, ISN's reach extends far beyond the Jesuit world to other religious communities, or other schools sponsored by religious communities, diocesan schools, parishes, countless Catholic partners whose hearts have been shaped by the same gospel impulse. That our love of God must always be inseparable from our love of neighbor, especially our most vulnerable neighbors. During ISN's 20th anniversary celebrations last year, Father Arturo Sosa, the current Superior General of the Jesuits worldwide, affirmed the importance of the Ignatian Solidarity Network as a lay collaborator, noting ISN's capacity to build and grow networks with a focus on inclusivity, our capacity to lead people to action through encounters with those on the margins, issue education, action skill building, and leadership formation, and, rooted in Catholic social teaching, cultivating transformation among young people that impacts them throughout their lives. What does the work of the real work of ISN look like today? Well, I want to share a few examples, right, that bring to life some of that transformative work in our key core issue areas. Okay, so I'm going to share a little bit about each one. I've got a couple examples I'll highlight. And for the Holy Cross students in here, you might think about, are there ways that we could get involved with that? Or are there other ideas we have that maybe we could work with ISN to bring to the larger network, okay? We talk a lot about justice as a virtue, something we feel and desire, but justice becomes real only when it shapes the systems we take part in every day. Which brings me to our first example. One of the clearest examples of this kind of structural faithfulness is the work that we do with the Catholic Ethical Purchasing Alliance, known as CEPA. CEPA began with a simple but uncomfortable question. What would it look like if Catholic institutions aligned their purchasing practices with the values they profess? Not just at the level of mission statements, but at the level of budgets, contracts, supply chains, purchasing policies, the places where justice is either strengthened or forgotten. Through CEPA, we've worked alongside garment workers, many of them women supporting families who have faced low wages, unsafe conditions, systematic exploitation. We've brought their stories directly to Catholic universities, high schools, parishes, not simply so institutions will feel compassion, but so they will change the systems that perpetuate the harm. And we've seen what happens when faith communities take this seriously. Across the country, we've seen administrators, faculty, sustainability teams, and student leaders at these campuses sit in rooms together asking hard questions. How do we make sure the clothes we purchase and the logos we print reflect our values? How do we ensure that workers who make our apparel are treated with dignity? What would it require of us to put Catholic social teaching at the center of our supply chain? Some schools have taken great steps to answer these questions. St. Louis University has become the first university bookstore partner with CEPA, shifting procurement toward worker-owned and ethically sourced apparel. Student leaders shaped by an immersion experience in North Carolina help push purchasing that prioritizes living wages, community investment, and environmental sustainability. At Mercyhurst University in Pennsylvania, students launched a CEPA club to promote ethical apparel awareness and institutional accountability. Through education campaigns and collaboration with campus sustainability efforts, they are helping the university align its purchasing with Catholic mission at every level of campus life. And at Santa Clara University, they've integrated Capeltique coffee into their campus dining. Capeltique is grown by indigenous cooperatives in Chiapas, Mexico, who've been accompanied for more than 50 years by the Mexican Jesuits, who are with a commitment to economic justice. So now when a student goes to grab a cup of coffee between classes at the business school cafe, they're not just fueling for the day, they're supporting a community-owned supply chain that protects culture, uplifts families, and lives the mission through something as ordinary as a latte or a mocha. Now it's important to note that CEPA is not charity. It is not helping from afar, just like the Martyrs. It is structural conversion, an ongoing process of realigning economic life of Catholic institutions with both dignity of workers and integrity of creation. And CEPA reminds us that environmental crises and the human labor crisis are not separate issues. Every t-shirt, every hoodie, every textile carries both a carbon footprint and a human story. To care for creation is to care for people who harvest the cotton, cut the patterns, stitch the seams, and package the boxes. That's why CEPA challenges institutions, including our Jesuit school partners, to examine not only what they believe, but how they operate. Because the Martyrs teach us that faith without justice is incomplete, and CEPA is one way our network is putting that conviction into practice. All right, but justice is not only about structures, it's also about relationships. So ISN's immigration work began at our 2008 spring teach-in. For many in the Ignatian Network, this was the first time they heard the stories of undocumented young people impacted by our country's immigration policies. They heard stories of people growing up in fear, excelling in school without a clear future because they didn't know if or where they would go to college, and contributing to communities that did not fully embrace them. Their testimonies were not arguments, they were true stories of real people asking for help, ensuring their inherent human dignity was upheld. And As an organization, we listened to them, and something became clear. Undocumented students needed not just programs, they needed one another. So in 2019, led by an ISN staff member with DACA status, we formed what was then called the Undocu Network and has been recently renamed the Unity Network. And this network provides community and support, leadership development, campus organizing strategies, and a collective voice within the church and among policymakers for this community of undocumented students across the country. This is solidarity in the Ignatian sense, not doing for, but walking with. I'd like to take a moment for you to hear from a few members of our Undocu Network, Maria, Alma, and Nestor, who offered these personal reflections at last year's Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice. So let's take a second to listen to them.
To Maria, Alma, and Nestor.
Good morning. How's everyone doing? Thank you guys so much for being here today and for hearing our story. In otra vida, in another life, we envision a world where labels like illegal aliens aren't used to dehumanize us and criminalize our existence. Where we wouldn't be defined by fear nor uncertainty. Where we would not live in a constant state of wanting to yell at a world that barely condones our whispers. Where our worth doesn't hinge upon a 9-digit social security number. Where we wouldn't have to think of the danger of sharing our truth and be freed from the fear of deportation. In esta vida, in this life, the identity we long believed we were left with was that of an illegal immigrant. We believed it defined us, we felt inferior and excluded, believing we lacked the same worth as our peers. We hid our legal status as if our story was something to be ashamed of. We felt voiceless, dreaming of things we could never do, like traveling abroad or learning to drive. Embracing our story has been one of our hardest battles.
Today, we proudly say, we are here and we are undocumented. We've come to understand the power of owning our stories. Sharing our story has allowed us to embrace our true selves. A powerful statement that we heard and gave us hope at the first Undocu Network Summit was, your story is your power. While we may not have control over our legal status, we do control our narratives, and that is something no one can take away from us. Participating in the first Undocu Network Summit was transformative for each of us. It opened our eyes to the importance of the visibility within the undocumented community. We were inspired by fellow students who openly share their experiences and fought for change on their campuses, despite the complexities of higher education. We were motivated by their courage, and we became committed to fostering solidarity and empowerment at Marquette University. This journey began with the establishment of the Marquette Dreamers organization, an important step in creating support for our immigrant community on campus. Following this, we launched the Dream Fellowship Program, the first fellowship in the state of Wisconsin to provide undocumented students professional development opportunities in their chosen fields. This is just the beginning of what we can achieve, not just for ourselves, but for generations to come.
Hello everyone, can you guys hear me? Yeah. We were kids when we came to this country, with our families. Now we stand here today, and we find ourselves in a unique space. The country where we were born often doesn't know us, and the country where we were raised doesn't accept us. But this land, this community, is the only home we've ever known. This country refuses to grant us rights. It's our country too. At the Undocu Network, we found a community that values our stories and supports our journeys. We learned that our experiences hold power, not in spite of our struggles, but because of them. We began to see strength in our heritage, resilience in our journeys, and empowerment in our identities. We have found the space to reclaim who we are and shatter the labels that have confined us for too long. We are embracing the freedom to define ourselves, choosing to be undocumented, unafraid, and unapologetic. Nuestra esperanza en el futuro, our hope for the future. To everyone who is undocumented, you matter, you are powerful, and you are not alone. It takes immense courage to speak openly about our status. Now we are asking you to summon that same courage when you meet with your elected officials today, and have the courage to demand pathways to citizenship for the millions of us who this country is home. Remember, this isn't just my movement, or Alma's movement, or Maria's movement. This is all of ours. It affects not only our friends, our families, and our communities. We're here, not just for ourselves, but for all of us. Thank you.
All right. So what? Oh, I'm showing my cards there. What the video doesn't tell you is that they were speaking in front of nearly 1,000 people. They were in front of the Capitol. I think you can tell that. And their collective courage helped move more than 100 congressional got out to over 100 congressional offices that day because advocates were going everywhere. So their stories, you heard them say it, our stories are our power, right? The story of the UCA martyrs has power. They did that because they weren't alone, because they had that network. They had people around them that were a community that honored their dignity, that recognized their gifts. They reminded them that their voices mattered, okay? They did it because young people in the Ignatian family are learning the same truth the martyrs learned, that when we stand together, rooted in faith, grounded in truth, and bounded by love, even systems built on fear must stop and pay attention, okay? I want to share also a little bit about how our work has taken us to the U.S.-Mexico border through a deep partnership with the Kino Border Initiative. Is there anyone who's visited the Kino Border Initiative here? Oh, excellent, a couple of folks, wonderful, okay. There we've listened to families fleeing extortion, sexual violence, trafficking, and threats of death. And we've witnessed firsthand how access to asylum, one of the cornerstones of international and U.S. law, has been dismantled across multiple administrations. Together with the Kino Border Initiative, we've helped Catholic communities see asylum not as a political wedge, but as a gospel call, a gospel mandate. Most recently, ISN, Kino Border Initiative, along with Network Catholic Social Justice Lobby and the Jesuits nationally, co-led a campaign called One Church, One Family. And there were 2 national days of public Catholic action for immigrant communities across the country. And there were upwards of 200 masses, prayer vigils, press conferences, and public witnesses to proclaim that every migrant family, every immigrant person is, in fact, our family, that we're all connected, that we're all one. Much like the public witness that Holy Cross organized during Bishop Sight's visit, these gatherings reminded us of something essential. When the Catholic community shows up publicly, prayerfully, prophetically, we are who the gospel calls us to be. Now, I want to share a brief video clip featuring the presence and voice of young people in the region, fellow Jesuit Jesuit high school, Xavier High School in New York City. Do we have any Xavier High School graduates here? No? Okay. Great school. New York City held a vigil last Thursday on the Feast of St. Francis Cabrini, a One Church, One Family vigil, and it got covered by New York City's NBC4. So here's a little glimpse into that.
Immigration reform, with hundreds of Catholic bishops signing off on a statement opposing the Trump administration's, quote, indiscriminate mass deportation of people, end quote. Well, today, students at one of the city's Catholic schools lent their voices to a national movement to support immigrants. News 4's Erica Byfield, live in Lower Manhattan with more. Erica.
Yeah, Natalie, as you mentioned, this is a national movement. A lot of events happening today and throughout this month, in fact, as people, in fact, Catholics come together to support immigrant rights. Nearly 30 Xavier High School students walked out, heading south, holding signs in support of immigrant rights.
Instead of just sitting and hoping for change, we're here out walking just because we think we can help bring it.
This journey, for some, is personal.
I understand the struggles of the immigrant community because I am a part of the immigrant community, even though I was born here.
Before they left, they prayed in recognition of the National Day of Prayer. This group is doing it in coordination with the One Church, One Family campaign, a movement in the U.S. that calls on Catholics to publicly demonstrate in solidarity with migrant families, asylum seekers, and refugees. Just this week, U.S. bishops issued a statement rebuking mass deportations and advocating for increased care for immigrants.
And we're at a place in our country where people live in fear, and it's really important for us to recognize that everybody who is here should have an opportunity to feel safe and at peace.
This track happening with support and permission of administrators and parents.
I'm very proud that they've decided to step out of class and let
those who are currently being oppressed in our country know that they are with them, thinking of them, praying for them.
Their walk ended just outside of 26 Federal Plaza, near the Manhattan Immigration Court, the scene of so many recent deportations, praying once more on the sidewalk, hoping their actions help spotlight the people and families behind the headlines.
We're not trying to get too political or try to be controversial anyway. We're just trying to draw the attention of the people here.
Organizers told us today there are more than 100 events happening like this across the country. Erica Byfield, News 4, New York.
All right. Events like this show that moral courage is not the work of extraordinary heroes, right? It can be high school students and parents and teachers walking out of school. It sounds kind of fun, actually. It is the work of ordinary people, right, that can make a difference, that can place human dignity above fear, above politics, above indifference. I'd like to finish by talking briefly just about we don't do that again. I want to talk briefly here about the Holy Cross delegation that was in Washington, D.C. for the Ignatian family teach-in before I finish up. So much of our work is doing formation, doing skill building, doing preparation that leads people to justice, right? And that formation can take people from places like classrooms and campus speakers to being part of public witnesses and courageous advocacy that make an impact. This group of Holy Cross students and staff, all right, did exactly that this past weekend at the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice and the Advocacy Day. 9 students, we have a couple of them here, accompanied by the staff, met face-to-face with Representative Jim McGovern. Now, he's a pretty friendly person, right? We don't have to be too worried about him, but he's actually someone who really knows the story of the UCA Martyrs, as I mentioned earlier, not from a distance, but from his time being Congressman Moakley's aide. He spent many months visiting El Salvador, and he continues to go back every November to take part in the commemoration vigil that happens there. And when they met last Monday with him, he listened to them. He listened to them share from their hearts about experiences with immigrant communities and experiences related to the environment. And then he actually offered to co-sponsor a bill because they asked him. So this is what happens, right, when we go into spaces like this. When we put our faith out there in the real world, something can happen. There can be an impact, all right? And that's generally like what ISN offers to students like yourselves. A space where your voice matters, a space where your convictions can grow, a space where you can have courage and you can join with others who have courage too to make a difference. And for those who haven't been to the teach-in, I want to encourage you to go right now. I want to encourage you to meet some of the students who went this year, and I want to encourage you to think about going next year, all right? The teach-in is a place where faith becomes something alive. It's a place where it's it's a fun gathering. It's really cool, and I hope you'll think about coming. But as we come to the end of this reflection, I want to return to the question that echoes from 1989 in the room today. What do we do now? In this world, in this moment, in this place, how do we allow the legacy of the martyrs to touch us, our lives, this campus here in Worcester, this community, our nation, the world? Because faith, the faith we inherited from the martyrs, is not a memory, right? It's something that calls us to action. And it's a call that becomes clearest when we look through the lens of the gospel. The gospel is not just something we study. It's a way of life revealed in the witness of Jesus. Christ shows us what love looks like in public, a love that walks towards suffering, that speaks truth to power and refuses to abandon the most vulnerable. That is the witness that the martyrs were drawn to, and we are invited to follow them. So I ask you, who are the crucified people in your field of vision? Whose stories in this place and time are you being asked to hear? Whose dignity are you being asked to defend? Where is God calling you to be uncomfortable? Because the martyrs didn't invite us to be heroes. We shouldn't be trying. They weren't trying to be martyrs. We shouldn't be trying to be martyrs. They invited us simply to be faithful, and faithfulness, real faithfulness, gospel-rooted faithfulness looks like truth-telling, solidarity, courage, and love that we allow to come out into the world. So tonight, as we remember Ignacio Echeverria, Segundo Montes, Ignacio Martín Baró, Juan Ramón Moreno, Armando López, Joaquín López y López, and Elba and Selena Ramos, may we hear their invitation. Listen to their invitation. Allow their invitation to sink in. Do not be afraid. Do not turn away. And do not underestimate the power of community that tells the truth, loves without hope, and believes stubbornly that hope can change the world. Because in the end, the blood of the martyrs is not the end of the story. The blood of the martyrs is a seed of hope. And now that hope is entrusted to us right here in this place. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chris. We so appreciate your leading us through this great legacy from 1989 till now, and the call to action you present to us. I would invite anyone who has questions to please come forward and give your question at the microphone. And if there's more than one people at one person at a time, you can line up behind the microphone.
Here comes someone. All right.
Hi, thank you for your talk. That was great. My question is, many Holy Cross students and I feel a call to help the poor and make central the suffering of the world, especially those in the Worcester community. But what are the first steps we could take to starting an initiative as students, even if it feels daunting, inaccessible, or we don't have any specific ideas of what to do first?
Yeah. Well, I think the first thing to do, and something about the martyrs that often people don't know. A lot of times when people hear about the martyrs, they assume that they lived in San Salvador and that's where they stayed all the time. Each one of those 6 Jesuits had deep relationships with communities outside of San Salvador. They would leave for the weekend and go celebrate the sacraments in communities, live in the communities, come to know the people. I've visited some of the communities that they ministered to. And so my point with that is, really find ways to encounter. Find what you have a general interest in, and then find ways to encounter people facing those realities. If you're concerned about the situation of immigrants, come to get connected with an organization here in Worcester or in Boston that is supporting the needs of immigrants and walking with immigrants. If you're interested in helping people impacted by environmental degradation, find an organization that's doing that work. And come to be more aware of what people are facing. Because that, at the end of the day, that is what will move you. That is what will move your peers. We are, it's all relational, right? And for the martyrs, it was all relational. They weren't just academics. They weren't just studying the need for liberation in El Salvador. They were living the need for liberation. They were with the people in need of liberation. So any ways you can find to come in contact with people. They might be here, they could be here on your own campus, but definitely in your communities as well.
Chris, I think a big topic of conversation and of action among our students and in the broader community is on the issue of migration at the moment. How, I wonder, and one reflection I think that I've been hearing repeatedly in some of the circles and conversations I've been having is that when people get together in groups that are addressing these different issues and at least talking it out and then taking action together, they feel much more empowered, they feel much more hopeful, and they feel they can contribute something that they couldn't contribute on their own. With respect to the Ignatian Solidarity Network, what are the ways on the issue of migration that maybe Holy Cross students and the broader Holy Cross community can engage with others across a network on this particular issue?
Yeah. So a couple ways. One, we would love to invite students here who come from undocumented or marginally documented backgrounds to become involved with our Unity network. It is a really great community of people that find so much value in being connected to each other, of having that community that allows them to do things like Alma and the other students did on Capitol Hill last year. I mean, the crazy thing about those little testimonies they gave is that none of them had ever told their story publicly before that day. That was the first time. And I actually went with Nestor to a congressional meeting, and he shared his story with a staffer in an office, a congressional office, that was not very supportive of immigrant communities. And it was the bravery, the courageousness that he had was totally impressive. So one, that's one area. But the other area is, we regularly throughout the year, organize campaigns where campuses can educate their communities about specific aspects of immigration policy through the lens of people who are directly impacted by it. And sometimes we don't have to look far to think about how we can help people reflect more deeply on immigration policy, right? Some of the One Church, One Family vigils and actions that took place on campuses. Inviting people, even in small communities, to think and to learn and to reflect, inviting people to think about what is your own immigration story, what value is there to that. So we have I was telling someone earlier today, we have a campaign each March called Ignatian Advocacy Madness. It's an invitation to engage in advocacy on immigration and ecology issues. And it's a competition between schools. And I'm not saying this to get you fired up, but Loyola Chicago won last year. Okay, so just so you know. And basically it's trying to get schools to engage in a depth of an amount of advocacy on those issues through actions, and you get different points for different types of actions and things like that. So trying to make it fun, right? Because this work can be fun. This work is fun. And then, the other thing, just thinking about the Ignatian Family Teach-In for Justice and the Holy Cross group that was there. I think one of the things about the Teach-In, especially the Advocacy Day, is that no one there thinks they can't do it, that they can't walk into a congressional office and share their own story or bring the stories of others, because there are so many people around them who are doing it, right? There is that power in community, that sense of knowing that you're part of something. And all of you should know that on a Catholic campus, on a Jesuit campus, you have peer institutions and peers who are struggling with some of the same desires, of how do I find meaning? How do I feel like I'm doing something in this moment where it feels so challenging and dark, right? So know that you are part of a larger community that is engaged. And your vigil that you held when Bishop Seitz was here, you weren't the only university doing that. You were part of something much bigger, and we should find grace in that, right? Oh, there's a question.
So I was doing a community service thing for a class just this morning, and on my way there, like in the 10-minute Uber ride across Worcester, I noticed dozens of people like on the streets, like barely able to afford clothes, etc. And I can't help but feel like I'm one person. I'd need to be an octopus to help as many people as clearly need help right now. And like, what would you say to feeling called in 17 directions at once to help people?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question, and I think we've all felt that tug at different times in our lives. And one thing I would say is find grace in the fact that you feel that, right? I think that's a sign that you're listening, that you're being moved by the values in you, whether they're values rooted in the gospel or somewhere else, right? And they're moving you to reflect on the world. That's exactly what you should be doing. I think that, in our lives, we have to decide where we do have a human capacity, right? That is limited. So we have to decide where can we put that energy, what can we commit ourselves to? And then for the things that we don't have the energy to commit ourselves to deeply, how can we simply be present to them in a way that doesn't, that as much as we can, lifts up, someone's dignity, right? Like, I struggle with that too. A place I drive to on a weekly basis, there are always people asking for food, asking for money at the side of the street, right? And sometimes I try to help them out. Sometimes I don't have anything with me, but I do think, can we always look someone in the eye? Can we always acknowledge their presence? Can we always, be present to them? I think that's really important. Knowing that we can't do everything, right? We have to find, we have to decide where their passion. That's the great thing about where you are right now, is that you have this opportunity to start to define how you will respond through your vocation of your work, of your life, right? That's, for us as an organization, that's a constant struggle, because we can't say yes to everything, and we have to define what we do. And hopefully as you do that, you get really good at responding to the needs of the world the way you've prepared yourself. It's a tough choice, tough reality, and I think you described it well. Yeah.
Chris, I want to just say thank you for earlier today and your words this evening. I was thinking about what you said about how the martyrs put their bodies physically in places where people were victimized, where there was oppression, and that was sort of what led to their murders. I've been thinking about the political moment that we're in, and I've been so moved by the images of people of faith, priests, ministers, lay people, standing up for their brothers and sisters in solidarity. And I'm wondering, as someone who's done this work for 2 decades, like the moral moment that we're in, right? And how are we being called to put our bodies in places where people are victimized?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. How many of you have visited the UCA in El Salvador? Raise your hand if you've been there before. Okay. So in the back of the chapel at the UCA, next to the Jesuit residence where the Jesuits in Alba and Salina were killed, on the back wall on the back wall of the chapel are images of people who were tortured by the government, and they were put in there during the Civil War, and then they've remained. And so imagine this, right? This is the chapel where weddings happen, where baptisms happen, where lots of joyous events happen, and there are these images of maimed people with bruises and cuts, and their mouths tied shut and things like that, hands behind them. It's really disturbing. And after the martyrs were killed, they basically said, we will never remove these. We always have to allow ourselves to keep this reality in mind, right? And so one thing I would say, for many people in our country, the challenges that the marginalization that immigrant communities are facing is not their reality, right? And it's easy, if we want to avoid reality. And I think what our faith calls us to, what the gospel calls us to, what the Ignatian approach that the Martyrs and Arupe call us to, is to be intentional about finding ways to be present to that reality, right? So that might be as simple as taking time to read the news every day and understand what's happening in this community, understand what's happening in our country, understand what's happening in our world. It's not pretty a lot of times, but if we don't do that, we're not being present to the reality, right? And then to say, how can I put myself in one way or another, in the midst of where people are being marginalized, in the midst of where people are under attack, right? I think, being out there in the streets, a couple weeks ago, right, for the vigil is one way we do that. But there are other ways too, right? And I think we now more than ever, we need to bring the gospel, we need to bring the teachings of our faith into the public sphere, right? And that's what's been exciting about the One Church, One Family movement, is that it's done that. Sometimes in more confrontational ways, like in Chicago, sometimes in less, confrontational ways. But like, if we all go one step further than we've been comfortable, it can make a big impact. And I think that's what we've seen over the past week. I'm watching those high school kids, and I am sure that for some of those boys, that was really uncomfortable, right? Think what it was like to be in high school, right? Some kids came out and did that, and some didn't, right? And then to be on TV, and then, have your friends giving you a hard time about it and stuff like that, right? That wasn't huge. They were just walking around 16th Street, not really like the edges of the margins of society in Manhattan, but like that was a step further, right? How can we all take another step further towards the margins, right? This idea of going towards the suffering, towards the vulnerable, towards the marginalized. What does that look like in your daily life?